The next thing is to invite John Miksic to come and speak, and he will be known to a great many of you for his very important archaeological work in Southeast Asia, and particularly indeed in Singapore. And I'm particularly pleased to be introducing him because when I received a copy of his recent book about the Maritime Silk Route and saw how he integrated the history of late medieval Singapore into the wider history of the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, it seemed to me a very impressive piece of work. So I'm very much looking forward, as I'm sure we all are, to hearing John Miksic.
Thanks very much first to David Abulafia. I've missed meeting him until today, so I'm very grateful for the chance to have a chance finally to get to meet him in person. And of course, I owe an eternal debt to Kwa Chong Guan, who had the intuition over 30 years ago that Singapore had an ancient history and archaeology to investigate, and it was up to me then to prove he was correct. And that's what I've been doing the last 30 years or so, among other things. So I'm also very happy to have a chance to be here at NTU and to speak to such an illustrious group of people from all sides of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. It's a really great opportunity to meet a number of people. I'm sure we'll have a lot of new ideas about the topics I'm going to talk about. I will, of course, be repeating some of the things that Professor Abulafia and Professor Kwa talked about, but hopefully I'll be able to say a few things differently as well. So I start off with these three words that I've read often are supposed to be the three main rules of real estate investing: location, location, and location. Supposedly, there is nothing else in real estate except the importance of the location. This is, if we apply it to the heritage of ports in Southeast Asia, which is my topic for this morning, we will see that that may not quite be so true. That in the case of Southeast Asia's ports in particular, they have been very evanescent, very shifting. It's been a constant process of readjustment, relocation over a period of 2,000 years. And so this has obvious implication for then trying to define a maritime heritage for both Singapore and the region, and then trying to figure out how to display this in such places as museums. So there have been different phases of Southeast Asian history, and each of them can be associated with different patterns of the distribution of port sites. A few years ago, before I did this book on Singapore and the Silk Road of the Sea, I did a book with three other historians about Singapore's maritime military history. And of course, one would think that, again, maritime sites of specific locations would be specifically strategic for a long period of time, that there would be certain constants which would arise over and over again, no matter what the kind of military threats or technologies were. But in Singapore's case, once again, this doesn't seem to be true. The whole meaning of the word strategic even is not set and universal. It's shifting constantly over time in Southeast Asia. So location is obviously not the sole determinant of why a port becomes successful or not, or why it becomes successful and then becomes unsuccessful again. And so there are lots of different factors we can look at to try and see what role they play as variables in determining the rise and fall of ports. Technology, including both the ships and the port technology, and also things like the building of canals, like whether the Suez Canal or, as some are predicting now, the Isthmus of Kra Canal, which has obviously strategic implications for Singapore. Political conditions, both within and beyond Southeast Asia. Military organization and security, clearly. The state of the regional economy and the bureaucracy and efficiency of the port administrations themselves. And this is something that historians and historical sources from Tome Pires in 1515, writing about Malacca, to Oliver Walters on Srivijaya have noted again. So I won't go through these. I'll just list them here, but I don't expect you'll memorize them all immediately. But just to say that we can divide up Southeast Asian history into quite a number of phases based on quite drastic changes in the internal and external environments of the Singapore region. And if we look at going back to the oldest phase, this is the prehistoric phase that Professor Kwa mentioned. We can more or less retrace a very early trading route from the mainland of China all the way through Southeast Asia, as far east as New Guinea, by the distribution of Bronze Age technology, Dongson drums. So there was a very long span of trade routes going all the way from China to the eastern edge of Southeast Asia by over 2,000 years ago. But we only have a few locations of ports that we know about from this period. We have the one in South Vietnam, probably connected with the kingdom of, known to the Chinese as Funan. We have some of the earliest port sites in Southeast Asia in southern Thailand. Another area is, of course, in the Kedah area of northwest Malaysia. And we have the area right around Palembang, the south end of Sumatra. And we have one site in West Java so far. The rest of the map of early Southeast Asian ports is a blank. We don't have any of ports in any of the other locations which have yet been identified. And since this is the more or less prehistoric period, we have no written records either to suggest where they might be, except for one on the island of Bali, which does, whether or not there was a kind of a yatra there was definitely a port on the north coast of Bali by about 2,000 years ago. Early Classic period, this is the beginning of intensive use of Indian symbols and mythology, architecture, and so on. In Southeast Asia, the use of writing, the construction of temples, and we have a couple of port sites in the region that we know of from this period, such as in South Thailand again, but different ports, not the same ones as in the late prehistoric era. We also have ones in the northeast coast of peninsular Malaysia, not the west coast. A couple of them in that region there. And then we have new ports popping up also in southeast Sumatra, different locations. And we'll look at some of the geographical correlates of those different locations later. And for the first time, we get one popping up all the way across the South China Sea in the Philippines. Middle Classic, this is when we begin to get the first intimations of Chinese presence, more or less sojourners still, not long-term settlers, but we get for the first time during the Song Dynasty more and more evidence of Chinese residing in Southeast Asia for longer and longer periods. And this is correlated with the changes in the port locations. Whether it's a cause or an effect or just not correlated at all, we can't say. Once again, there are new ports again popping up in the Isthmus of Kra region, but different locations again. New ports again in the northern part of Malaysia. For the first time, north tip of Sumatra, we begin to get some archaeological remains. No doubt there are earlier ones, but because of the severe tectonic activity, where the north coast of Aceh is sinking at a rate of about, say, 20 or 30 centimeters a century, obviously the really old sites are all under the water already. The west coast of Sumatra, for the first and more or less the last time, becomes an important location for port areas. And we get yet more ports popping up in different parts again of southeast Sumatra. We don't get any ports yet, for example, in all of Java for this period. No port sites whatsoever during the period of the construction of the great temples of Borobudur, Prambanan, and so forth. Obviously they exist, just that we have not yet even uncovered a trace of any of them. Late Classic period, this is of course the period when we do get permanent Chinese settlement in Southeast Asia. This is when we begin to get the first trickling of Islam into the region as well. So some major shifts again are taking place, and this is correlated with the rise of new ports. The first real port in the area near Bangkok, Ayutthaya, pops up around this time. Kota Batu, Brunei, shows up for the first time on Borneo. Again, more ports in the north coast of Sumatra and the southeastern region again, southeastern region. And we begin to get some port activity in Java for the first time that we can actually study. For the most part, we just have to assume that they were there for the earlier periods. It's only in this late Classic era, the transition into the Post-Classic, that we begin to get any kind of archaeological data. Post-Classic, this is like the period of Europeans coming in. It's the fall of the great early kingdoms, the rise of places like Malacca, and eventually then, of course, West Java. Ayutthaya continues to be important in Thailand. It's one of the longest existing ports, actually, in Southeast Asia. Even Singapore, despite its relatively short history compared to places in the Mediterranean, is one of the oldest capitals in Southeast Asia. Most of the capitals in Southeast Asia arose after the 14th century, after the Post-Classic. The Santa Ana area of Manila also appears on the archaeological map for the first time. Kota Batu, Brunei continues on, And of course, now we could argue whether Brunei is at all significant as a port any longer. South Thailand again, we have another port site, so always these same regions seem to be strategic, but the location specifically of the ports keeps on shifting around. And this is when we get Malacca appearing as well. Again, more ports in North Sumatra, Southeast Sumatra, the same general areas, but the eastern part of the archipelago, the Suge area, which is actually the source of much of the wealth of the long-distance maritime trade, we still don't even have any trace of archaeological sites. This is when we get Bantam as well, the place where the Portuguese, later on, of course, the Dutch and the English set up some of their earliest port bases, also Bantam. Mentioned in Purchas's Pilgrims as one of the early sources of that kind of travel literature in Europe and so on. Early modern ports again. So just looking at the different spots on maps where these things pop up. So if I had maybe one of these technological geniuses here in the future is going to come up with an easier way of kind of animating this. But so far this is the best we can do given the kind of material we have. So there's a lot of variation. We can, if we had an animated thing, we could show all these different kind of amoeba-like systems rising and falling, shifting around over time. But how much of this variation is real and how much is just due to our lack of knowledge? Lack of archaeological research, lack of historical sources. The area all the way from Borneo to New Guinea is almost completely unexplored, archaeologically speaking. And we have almost no historical sources from those parts of the region. We have more historical writings from the western part of Southeast Asia. We have not only local writings, we have Chinese and Indian and even European writings going all the way back to 2,000 years ago. Claudius Ptolemaeus and his cosmographic research. Where he even shows a place near Singapore called Sabana, but very little archaeological information. So now I'm going to go on and look a little bit at what we do have from the archaeological side, while keeping in mind this is very fragmentary and no doubt biased. We do have Chinese pottery popping up already from the Western Han period in that area of South Thailand. Khao Sam Keo, which is not an actual port site, like a lot of the sites we know of. It's near the seacoast, but it was not an actual port. It's situated at some distance in the hinterland. We do have Western Han-type pottery as well as some of these bronze drums. So this is a kind of an outgrowth of a pre-existing kind of a trade network which already linked together places around the South China Sea before the foundation of the Han Empire. Then, of course, in South Thailand, we also, same areas, we get the earliest Indian types of artifacts, whether they're coins or whether they're little inscriptions on rings, beads, and so forth. So already the link between India and China was forged in the Malay Peninsula more than 2,000 years ago. And West Asian objects also pop up here not too long afterwards. Already by this time, it seems like Malayo-Polynesians were sailing all the way to the northeast coast of Africa. They're mentioned in some of the early Greek geographies like Strabo and so forth, coming across the Indian Ocean on rafts, not even on ships. But then, of course, that's what the early Malayo-Polynesians used to colonize the Pacific, rafts. So West Asian contacts were established in the Sasanian period already, pre-Islamic era, and then these things pop up in places like South Thailand again. But one of the problems we have, of course, is that looting. A lot of these early port sites have already been destroyed by things like people digging up large areas for ancient beads, one of the most popular things to sell from these sites. Ancient Indian beads. So here you can walk along the shores of the southeastern coast of Thailand, pick up Tang Dynasty Changsha wares all over the beach. All those little spots you see on the sand there, that's Changsha ware. And you can see all these holes in the sand dunes right near the coastline here. That's all from looters' pits. So if you look to some of the things that have been collected from the surface, we can see both Indian and Chinese objects here. But nothing whatsoever on the ports themselves. All we know are more or less the locations where some of these artifacts were later on being used. A lot of these port environments are not very propitious for archaeological research because they don't tend to be on dry land anyway. They tend to be in mangrove swamps. This is where I first came to Southeast Asia in 1968, living in this area around the Bujang River Valley north of Penang, northwest coast of Peninsular Malaysia. This area has been an active port area for about 2,000 years. And as you can see, it's a very mangrove-like estuarine region, but the actual port sites have shifted around quite a bit over a period of 1,500 years, from far down in the south up to the northern part of that region. So again, it's kind of good from an archaeological point of view because you can separate the different periods of development there. And recently there's been a fair amount of archaeological research, finally. One of the sites that pops up a lot in recent discussions is called Sungai Batu, and this is one of the remains which has been excavated by the University Science Malaysia in Penang. A very strange brick structure, might be the oldest brick structure in Southeast Asia. We don't have any real confirmed dating on it yet, but it has this strange kind of square object on top of a round foundation and so on. This place is extremely important because it's the first site in Southeast Asia with a large quantity of Buddhist artifacts. And it has one inscription which is actually in the form of a prayer for a safe voyage by a sea captain, whose name was Buddhagupta. And he was setting off from a place called Raktamratika in Sanskrit, which means red earthland or Tanah Merah. Probably not the Tanah Merah in Singapore, but some Tanah Merah somewhere in this region. So it's one of the earliest indications of this very strong link between port sites and Buddhism. And right next to this little site, there is the kind of remains of a silted-in river, which is only now beginning to be probed by using kind of remote sensing, where supposedly there are buried ships as much as 7 meters deep. But now the Malaysian archaeologists are looking for funding to excavate this. The little site museum there does have quite a number of old remains of ship carcasses, but these have not been even dated by radiocarbon. So no doubt there will be more evidence coming from that region in the future if proper research is conducted. West Java, again, this is one of the main kinds of sites where these earlier ports are located. Now it's in the middle of a coastal plain, which 2,000 years ago probably was still semi-swamp-like. Now it's lowland rice growing land, but beneath the rice paddies are remains of Buddhist temples with kind of South Indian style stucco wares as well as local gold objects and so on, and associated with things like this very interesting type of ceramic. Obviously most of what was traded 2,000 years ago was long ago perished, rotted away, but the pottery does survive. And we have a really specific name for this kind of pot, Romano-Indian rouletted pottery. It's made in South India around 2,000 years ago using a technique pioneered in Rome, but copied by Indian potters in the Rika Medu area near Chennai today. And we find these all the way as far east as the north coast of Bali. So this is the area of Sembiran, the north side, not down the south where all the nice tourist beaches are, but we have this north coast which is gradually eroding away from the waves. So this site is gradually disappearing. But we have also the same kind of Romano-Indian pottery on the north coast of Bali, indicating that by 2,000 years ago, there was already contact as far east. Doesn't show by itself that there was any Indian going there, but the skeleton does. The skeleton in the upper left has been DNA checked, and the signature is that of a South Asian. So there were Indians actually getting this far east as long as 2,000 years ago. Quite a surprising development. Again, in the South Sumatra area, the oldest port sites are down near the mouth of the Musi River there. So this is the South Sumatra region. This is modern Palembang up here. But the oldest sites are way down here in the coastal plain. It used to be thought that all this was relatively recently formed land. But in fact, now we know that there were sites there about 2,000 years ago. But since they're at the water table level, they require a lot of energy, a lot of resources to pump the water out long enough to get some artifacts. But we are discovering things like pre-Indic style gold work and pottery of the period, again, the Romano-Indian style, before Chinese pottery comes into the region. And so this is the area of modern Palembang, which by the 7th century had usurped the position earlier on played by those lowland coastal ports. This is about 90 kilometers upstream. And it's still estuarine, it's still tidal that far inland. The river here is about 1 kilometer wide in modern Palembang. And this is one of the longest existing ports in Southeast Asia. It's been around probably about 1,500 years, and it has an interesting colonial past as well. It has quite strong connections with Singapore in terms of its long-established Arab community, the Alsagoffs and so on. They had their bases there. Alsagoff is another well-known Arab name in Singapore as well. One of the unfortunate habits of Southeast Asians has been that they live on top of the water, especially in the port areas. They don't live on the dry land, partly because you had to pay tax if you lived on land, but partly because when it floods, your house just goes up and down. So a lot of them have lived on rafts for over 2,000 years, or on these stilts over the water. About the only people who lived on land were the nobility. Down here, this is early 20th century Palembang. That's the old royal palace. And here are all the people. So the subject lived here on top of the water, and only the royalty lived on the dry land. So this is not going to leave a whole lot of evidence for us archaeologists to study. Now, this is an early map made of the settlement patterns in Indonesia. This is Netherlands Indies, Atlas van Nederlands Indie. It shows the various kinds of associated settlement patterns found in places like Java. And then it shows Palembang. Alfred Russel Wallace, the famous naturalist who visited here in the 1850s, said that Palembang was 5 miles, 8 kilometers long, and 1 house wide. So not very much is going to be left for us to study of that period. Where the artifacts are found is under the water of the river. About 4 years ago, the Southeast Asia Games were held in Palembang. They needed a lot of sand for construction of new facilities. They started dredging the river, and they started finding tons of archaeological remains under the river. And of course, there was no research done. These have all been sold off by the various locals, but you find tons and tons of Chinese pottery. You find also carved Buddhist images, all of this under the river, all of it under the radar of the archaeologists. We find local pottery as well, intact objects. We find gold objects, no doubt locally made. The whole thing is, again, we find Tang Dynasty ware of the type we would expect if people like Yi Qing and other Buddhist pilgrims from China were stopping off for long periods to study Sanskrit in Sumatra. And the record doesn't stop there. It goes on into the Ming, the Qing, tons and tons of coins. All this stuff, of course, will never be documented except with a little tip of the iceberg that one happens to get if one visits Palembang now and then. So a lot of other records of port sites are very difficult to define. They'll be very difficult to reclaim, very difficult to incorporate into any kind of museums about maritime heritage. The site of Malayu, however, is another very important location, not only because of its name, it's where the Malay kind of group got its name from, but also because of its very important history in the evolution of Buddhism. In the early 11th century, the famous Buddhist Atisha lived here for 10 or 12 years before he went to Tibet and reestablished Buddhism in Tibet. And he probably took a great proportion of what he knew or thought about Buddhism from this site, because he went here to study with a local teacher. So this is an important area. There are still large-scale Buddhist remains here at the place called Muara Jambi, which is about, this is getting down here. It's about 120 kilometers up the stream. It's still in a swampy zone. It's still a center of local shipbuilding. It's like this ship you see at the upper left. This one still has the side rudders, just like they were using on Borobudur 1,000 years ago. There's now a concentrated push going on to try and reconstruct a lot of the old Buddhist structures here in order to maybe push it as a kind of a new World Heritage Site, if it can be listed. So that means a lot of these old brick ruins are now being rapidly restored, in many cases, however, without proper documentation. Like all these pieces of Chinese ceramics here, those again were picked out of the riverbed. So there's a lot of haste, which is making a lot of waste, unfortunately, as far as the recovery of the early ports, cultures, and heritage of Southeast Asia is concerned. Here we have one of the most beautiful statues of an esoteric female Buddhist deity, Prajnaparamita. Gives us some indication of what the culture of this area was like during the period when it was a very important trading port, which only lasts about 200 years, by the way. A lot of the sites I worked on tend to be in the same swampy areas. This is where I worked for my PhD, a place called Chinese Fort, Kota China. Dates from this kind of Middle Classic period, around 11th, 12th century. It's in a swamp, this area underneath this A coconut plantation seems to have been a very large city of the 12th, 13th century, Song dynasty. And these are my first research assistants here, helping me sort out things from inside of the little cuttings in the creeks. And there are remains, again, under the mangrove areas of old Buddhist sites. Some Buddhist sculptures, some in the houses of the local Chinese inhabitants, as well as Chinese and local pottery. So the material is there, but it's not nearly as exciting as either a ship or a palace or a temple. And this is one of the problems of trying to make sense and make interesting any kind of displays about maritime heritage, except for ships. Ships are sexy objects. They're the most sophisticated ancient machines human beings made. And if you look at the Borobudur, for example, Professor Kwa's picture, you see the dynamic way the ship is forging through the water. There is no port displayed on Borobudur. There's no port in any early Southeast Asian art. Ships, yes. Ports, no. Nothing to do with urbanization. Nothing to do with the actual places where the ships were going. Now, shipwrecks are really useful, but they're instant in time. They're like a snapshot of one specific tragedy when the ship sank. Whereas ports are much more important in the sense that they give us the longue durée in Brodell's sense of the word, the long-term developments, the long-term expansion, and we can look much more specifically at why things happen the way they do than we can from a shipwreck. We have shipwrecks in Southeast Asia going back to about the 3rd century up the Pontian in Pahang. Not the Johor Pontian, there's another one in Pahang, which is a trading ship. It has some remains of cargo from South Vietnam on it, but still that site has never been excavated. It was found in the 1920s. No one's ever gone and actually looked for the remains of this probable 3rd century port up in Pahang. Of course, the Belitung controversy, some of you will know. We're going to see, of course, some of this. Well, we won't see any of this material because we're going to the museum on Sentosa tonight, where you will see some things connected with the Belitung, but most of it is incorrectly displayed, I'm afraid. If you want to see the actual pottery, you have to go to the Asian Civilizations Museum, and that would be a whole talk in itself, why these two things are separate. But there's still a controversy as to where this port was even, where the port was, where were the ship going? The era when the Chinese began to reside in Southeast Asia is a very interesting period to study. We're still looking at sites like in Kedah, and this is along the Bujang River Valley. Some research was done here, including by Wang Gongwu when he was a student at the University of Malaya back in the 1950s. We actually had an archaeology club here, and he dug some of these sites up there. And this site is quite interesting because it's the only kind of port area we know of where there was an external invasion. Kedah was invaded and conquered by an Indian prince. This is quite clear from inscriptions in India. It's also quite clear from the archaeological remains in Kedah itself, because we have this transition from Buddhism to Hinduism. Very sudden and obviously connected with the conquest of the Buddhist society by the South Indian Cholas, who were devotees of Shiva. But this only lasted for about 100 years, until about 1200. Then the Cholas began to go under in India, and whether or not it's correlated with that, the history of the Kedah site also begins to decline at the same period. But what's the correlation? It's kind of difficult to say. There is one, but what is it? We do have, however, Song dynasty materials as well as Middle Eastern glassware from the site. But there's a huge amount of research to be done in that region. Late Classic, the Postclassic, this is, of course, the period of Islam coming into Southeast Asia when India herself was also mainly under Islamic rule. Chinese immigrants, including females, began to reside in Southeast Asia. We know because one of the rulers of the port, Palembang, for a period in the early 15th century was female, the Chinese woman. So what was their impact on ports? Well, we hardly know. We have almost no historical or archaeological data to try and just figure what was the Chinese impact on the port development. Singapore, at this moment, would have to be considered one of the most well-studied sites from the standpoint of archaeology, since for the last 30 years we have been studying this. And of course, we saw Professor Abulafia showed his picture of the Fort Canning site. When the British arrived, there were abundant archaeological remains, but they never studied them. There was ruins on Fort Canning. There was an old inscription at the mouth of the Singapore River. And our excavations, we have found what is the oldest known compass from Southeast Asia, which dates from the Yuan period, 14th century. It's this bowl at the bottom right. But we're still arguing over whether it was actually used for navigational purposes, or was it for feng shui, geomancy. It might not have been for actual use on a ship, but we have the oldest known compass in Southeast Asia. And so there are quite a number of sites in downtown Singapore, surprisingly, which still can be studied archaeologically. Some of them up on Fort Canning Hill, but some of them along the Singapore River. And so these are some of the approximately 10 sites in the 14th century urban area we have studied. A number of them, such as the one at the mouth of the river, actually do show us something about an actual port. That's next to the Empress Place building, which is now the Asian Civilizations Museum. We did get to do some excavations under this little green patch here, which was the old riverbank. And of course, again, that's difficult because it's between the low and high tides. When the tide comes up in the morning, we have to get out because we can't pump it all out. So the degree of research you can do there is limited. But we were able to find things like traces still preserved of old wooden objects because of the preservative value of being permanently waterlogged. These are remains of probably old nibong kind of trees, a kind of hollow tree which is very resistant to salt water, to which ports used to have a lot of these poles for ships to tie up to. And we find other kinds of preserved objects like this, various kinds of things, the detritus of a port. It's not easy, but this is the kind of work which is the only type of research we can actually use to get some kind of indication of the real life of the port, which is 90% of maritime heritage. Well, even maybe less, but something like that. Other ports like Tuban, Port of Majapahit, again, it was a very important port for about 200 or 300 years. It was probably the port of Singapore's overlord during this period. Now it's just a fishing village. Beautiful little site, but no port activity going on there. We know there are lots of archaeological remains underneath the harbor, but archaeologists are always chased away by the looters who have guns, and we don't. So we never got to do any research under the harbor of Tuban. One interesting question that has to do with the effect of the so-called Ming Gap, which is the period after Chang He, for about 70, 80 years, when China cut off almost all connection with the outside world. And for this period then, the Chinese communities which were in the region seem to have all amalgamated or assimilated into the local cultures, because when the Portuguese come, they only mention one Chinese settlement, which is in Ayutthaya. There's none in Malacca, for example. So what was the effect of this kind of Ming ban and the cessation of Ming trade for about 80 years? Seemingly very little. As far as we can tell, trade went on, mainly with the Indian Ocean, with the Muslim areas such as Gujarat. Didn't really affect Southeast Asia's economy all that greatly. Of course, this was then the period when Malacca became a famous port in Europe, which attracted the Portuguese to go all the way around the south tip of Africa in order to seize it. And so we do have this Maritime Museum on Sentosa, where I hope a lot of you are going this evening. And so it has a big Chang He ship fabrication. So Chang He is one of the main themes, the 15th century. You'll see some recreated souks along the trade route that Chang He visited. And we'll see the Jewel of Muscat itself, which is a replica of the Belitung shipwreck of the 9th century. The Typhoon Theater, I hope we get a chance to go through there. I'm not giving anything away about what you're going to see, but just say there is a Typhoon Theater. I hope we get to go there. And there's a tiny little area on the artifacts of Singapore. And then there's the shipwreck, which is from the Chang He period. So there's the replica of the large ark of Chang He, supposedly. And there's the Jewel of Muscat, which did sail from Muscat to Singapore, given by the government of Oman to Singapore. And this is a little area about Temasek trade, and you have to look hard to find it. But the Bacau shipwreck, again, that's in the same little area. It's an early 15th century shipwreck. It has maybe the oldest shipboard cannon in the world on that wreck. And you will get to see how many people actually go there, as opposed to how many go straight into the aquarium and bypass the archaeological site altogether. I could go on and talk a bit more about other museums, but I'm over time. The Maritime Museum in Malacca, why is it in the shape of Alfonso d'Albuquerque's ship? Why is it all full of replicas instead of original things? Why was the river, the Malacca River, the old port site, completely dredged to make a pedestrian walkway with no research? Why do they have a Dutch windmill? Banten Lama, another interesting site. Again, I don't have time really to go through that, but just to say that the museum is one thing, that there's still a very active port life, but it's mainly now restricted to local shipping, local fishermen, and so on. And finally, this is the last one. This is a modern village down on the island of Linga in the Rio Archipelago. It's 100% Chinese. About 10,000 people live on this little, it's completely built over the water. Everything is built on wood. So the roads, the pathways, the houses, all on wood over the water. So this is what even the ports in the Chinese early phase of settlement also probably looked like. So the final questions are, if port sites are impermanent, how can we define their heritage? If they're built over water, if they shift around so frequently in the region, how do we define them? Except as part of a network. And again, Professor Abulafia mentioned that, and I think that's a very important idea. But then how do we realize it? How do we materialize it? The institutions of the maritime Silk Road have been pretty firm for 2,000 years, but the port structures are not. So how do we define the local architectural heritage of a port or a local identity? How do we capture and represent maritime heritage to the public in this case? And what other kinds of maritime heritage institutions and displays can we devise? And this is where NTU comes in, institution with information technology. How can we maybe bank on this kind of technology here to maybe do things that we can't do in a traditional museum? So if maritime heritage is dynamic rather than static, how can we recreate it? That's my question. I hope some of you will answer that. Thank you very much.